There are no diaries, no schedules, no hourly records of anyone who lived 10,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago scratching out what they did before sunrise or how they spent the hour before sleep. And yet we actually know quite a lot. From fire-cracked bones and scorched hearthstones, from the wear patterns on ancient tools and the isotopes locked inside fossilized teeth, from footprints pressed into dried mud and pigment smeared across cave walls, archaeologists have spent decades piecing together something remarkable, a picture of ordinary life in a world that left no written word behind. Add to that the careful, respectful study of modern hunter-gatherer communities, people whose ways of living offer at least a partial window into deep human patterns, and suddenly the silence of prehistory starts to speak. But here's where it gets complicated, because most of us come to this topic already carrying a story. Maybe it's the brutish caveman dragging himself through a miserable existence, one bad day away from starvation, living in fear of everything larger than him. Or maybe it's the opposite, the noble, peaceful forager, lounging in nature's abundance, working a few hours a day and spending the rest in blissful leisure. Both of those images are out there, and both of them are wrong in ways that are genuinely worth understanding. The truth, as best as we can reconstruct it, is more interesting than either version. Stone Age life was hard in ways we rarely appreciate and skilled in ways we almost never acknowledge. It demanded knowledge, decision-making, physical endurance, social intelligence and creativity every single day. It also had its rhythms, its rest, its moments of connection, and probably its moments of something we might recognize as joy. So the question this video sets out to answer is a deceptively simple one. What might a full day have actually looked like? From the moment someone opened their eyes at dawn to the moment they closed them again at night, what were they doing? What were they thinking about? What were they working through? Now, before we go any further, one important caveat. The phrase Stone Age humans covers an enormous stretch of time and geography. We're talking about people who lived across tens of thousands of years, on every continent, in tundras and rainforests and savannas and coastlines. No single daily routine could possibly represent all of them. A band of hunter-gatherers following herds across Ice Age Europe lived very differently from coastal foragers in Southeast Asia 8,000 years ago, and differently again from groups surviving in arid interior landscapes. So rather than pretending there's one universal Stone Age schedule, this video focuses on broad patterns, things that show up again and again across the archaeological record and across hunter-gatherer research, while acknowledging that the details would have shifted dramatically depending on where and when you were alive. What we're building here is a plausible day, not a definitive one. A composite sketch drawn from evidence, inference, and careful comparison. We'll move through waking up in a camp that looked nothing like a modern bedroom, through the serious and skilled business of finding food, through the hours of tool work and hide preparation and childcare that filled the gaps, through the dangers that were never far away, and finally into the firelit hours of evening before sleep. So let's start at the beginning, with the moment someone in the deep past opened their eyes and the day began. Before we can talk about what any given day looked like, it helps to be clear about what we're even referring to when we say the Stone Age, because the term covers more time than most people instinctively grasp. The Stone Age is, at its simplest, the long period before humans began working metal. It stretches back more than 3 million years to the earliest known stone tools, and depending on where in the world you look, it ends somewhere between 5,000 and just a few hundred years ago. Within that vast span, archaeologists traditionally distinguish between phases, the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, representing different tool technologies, different economies, different relationships between people and the landscape. But for the purposes of this video, We're not going to treat those as a rigid timeline to memorize. What matters is the underlying way of life. And for the overwhelming majority of that time, across the overwhelming majority of human populations, that way of life meant mobile hunter-gatherer bands, small groups of people, likely between 20 and 50 individuals at any given time, moving across a landscape they knew intimately, living by hunting animals, fishing where water allowed, and gathering everything from plant foods to shellfish to insects to honey. That pattern holds for most of human prehistory. It is, in a very real sense, the default human experience. But here is where the idea of a typical day immediately starts to fracture. Because that same broad lifestyle, mobile foraging, played out under conditions so different that the daily routines of two hunter-gatherer groups could be almost unrecognizable to each other. Season alone could transform everything. A summer day on the northern European tundra during the late Paleolithic, when long daylight hours made large game hunting practical and plant foods briefly abundant, looked nothing like a winter day in the same region. When cold dictated shelter, food stores mattered enormously, and movement became dangerous. Climate shaped not just comfort, but strategy. Region shaped diet, tool types, and social organization. The presence or absence of large prey animals, the proximity of reliable water, the density of edible plants, all of these pushed daily behavior in different directions. Then there's the question of which humans we're talking about. For much of the Stone Age, anatomically modern humans weren't the only people on the landscape. Neanderthals persisted in Europe and Western Asia until roughly 40,000 years ago. Denisovans ranged across parts of Asia. The evidence increasingly suggests these weren't simple, interchangeable versions of each other. They had real behavioral differences, different ranges of adaptation, and likely different daily rhythms, even if the broad challenge of feeding and sheltering a group united them all. All of which brings us to the evidence itself and its limits. Reconstructing ordinary daily behavior from the archaeological record is genuinely difficult, because what survives is rarely the mundane. Stone tools preserve well, wooden ones almost never do. Bones that were cracked and burned leave traces. Plant foods rarely leave anything at all. We can find evidence of a kill site, but we can't recover the conversation that happened around it. We can analyze the wear on a tool and infer it was used for scraping hide, but we can't know if the person using it was bored or focused, working in silence or teaching a child beside them. The record gives us actions more readily than it gives us experience. Ethnographic studies, observations of more recent hunter-gatherer communities, add texture and plausibility, but they can't simply be transplanted wholesale into the deep past. They're a source of hypotheses, not answers. So what this video offers is a composite. A day assembled from recurring patterns in the archaeological record, from what we know about human physiology and the demands of foraging life, and from carefully weighed comparisons across cultures and time periods. Not a reconstruction of one specific person's experience, but a plausible shape of how the hours might have unfolded, the rhythms that appear, again and again, whenever people lived this way. With that framing in place, let's actually start the day. Wherever our Stone Age humans spent the night, it almost certainly wasn't chosen at random. The selection of a sleeping place was itself a decision layered with practical knowledge, an expression of everything a group understood about the landscape they moved through. The most durable evidence we have comes from caves and rock shelters, and it's no accident those sites dominate the archaeological record. They survive, they preserve, they collect debris across thousands of years of use and leave us something to excavate. But it would be a mistake to picture Stone Age life as fundamentally cave-bound. Many groups, perhaps most during warmer periods and in more temperate regions, slept in open-air camps, in temporary structures built from whatever materials the landscape offered: branches, hides, grasses, bone, bark. At sites like Ohalo 3 on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, preserved under water for around 23,000 years, archaeologists found the remains of brush huts arranged deliberately around a central hearth, which tells us something important. Even temporary camps had structure. They weren't just scattered sleeping spots, they were designed spaces. What those structures actually looked like varied enormously. In some regions, people may have built low windbreaks from stacked stones or piled branches, just enough to cut the wind and retain warmth close to the body. In others, hides stretched over frameworks of bone or wood created something closer to a tent. In caves, the choice of where within the cave to sleep mattered, deep enough for shelter from weather and predators, but not so deep as to lose the benefit of a fire's light and warmth near the entrance. The back of a cave could be cold, damp, and dark. The threshold zone, just inside the opening, was typically where evidence of sustained habitation clusters most strongly. Bedding is harder to trace, but it existed. At Sibudu Cave in South Africa, researchers identified layers of plant material, sedges and other grasses, that appear to have been deliberately gathered and arranged as bedding, dating back around 77,000 years. Some of those layers included aromatic plants that may have had insect-repelling properties, which suggests not just comfort, but something closer to deliberate management of the sleeping environment. Skins likely played a role in colder regions, layered beneath and over sleeping bodies. And bodies themselves were a heat source. In small groups sleeping close together, shared warmth was a real survival factor, especially in cold seasons. The clustering of individuals, and perhaps the arrangement of bodies with the most vulnerable children and the elderly toward the center and warmth, may have been habitual and unconscious, the kind of spatial logic that gets absorbed over a lifetime without ever being explicitly taught. The fire mattered enormously to all of this. Embers banked carefully before sleep could be coaxed back to life in the morning, which was far less costly in time and effort than starting fire from scratch. Evidence from various sites suggests that hearths were often centrally located within living spaces, and their maintenance was likely a continuous concern. Waking up to cold, dead ash was a problem. The first person to stir in the morning may well have gone directly to the fire, feeding it, blowing it back to life, getting warmth and light moving before anything else happened. In that sense, the hearth structured the morning before anyone had made a conscious decision about how to spend the day. What would have actually pulled people awake? Probably a combination of factors we no longer think about. Light, for one. In the absence of enclosed shelters with controlled interiors, the shift from darkness to dawn would have been immediate and biological. Human sleep patterns before artificial lighting appear to have differed from modern patterns in meaningful ways, with some research suggesting a tendency towards segmented sleep, a first sleep, a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, and a second sleep before dawn. If that pattern was common, some members of the group may already have been intermittently awake through the night, tending fire, listening. Predators were a real concern, and the sounds of the surrounding landscape, a shift in the behavior of birds, a sudden silence, the movement of something large nearby would have been meaningful signals to people who read that environment the way we read text. Weather would have shaped the morning's first moments just as directly. Waking to rain, to heavy frost, to unexpected warmth, each of those changed what the day could or should involve. The decision to move camp, to hunt in a particular direction, to spend the day on processing and maintenance rather than travel, all of those decisions were made in the morning in response to immediate conditions. There was no calendar, no fixed schedule. What the day became was, in part, negotiated with the environment as the light came up. Whether those negotiations happened in silence or in conversation is something we can only speculate about, but the latter seems more likely. Ethnographic observations of contemporary and recent hunter-gatherer societies consistently describe mornings that begin socially, people talking, joking, discussing the previous day or the day ahead, sharing food or water before dispersing. There's a reasonable argument that this pattern has deep roots. The hearth, as both heat source and gathering point, naturally draws people together in the first light, and the transition from sleep to the day's work may rarely have been abrupt. Some researchers have suggested that a period of relatively slow social awakening, what you might call a collective orientation to the day, was actually functionally useful, allowing the group to share information about what individuals had observed, heard, or dreamed before, splitting apart into different tasks. Looking at the camp itself in that early morning light is itself revealing. The layout of a camp, where the hearth sat, where sleeping areas were arranged, where tools and food stores were kept, already encoded the group's priorities. The hearth at the centre meant warmth and light were communal resources, not individual ones. Sleeping positions around it reflected something about social relationships and protection. The placement of sharper tools, materials under preparation, or cached food at the edges of the living space kept certain hazards and resources organized. Even a temporary camp was a kind of argument about how people should relate to each other and to their environment, made in spatial terms. The camp that a Stone Age group woke up in wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a concentrated expression of what they valued and how they managed risk, warmth, proximity, fire, and the visible presence of the people around them. Mourning in that context wasn't a private experience. It was a collective one. The day didn't start when any single person opened their eyes. It started when the group began to orient together, reading the weather, checking the embers, taking stock of what the night had left them with, and beginning the first conversations about what came next. Once the group had oriented itself to the morning, read the weather, revived the fire, exchanged whatever the night had taught them, attention turned almost immediately to the question that structured most of the waking day: food. Not in the anxious, panicked way the word survival sometimes implies, but as the central organizing logic of what came next. Where do we go? What's likely to be there? Who goes which direction? The answers to those questions weren't random. They were the product of accumulated knowledge applied to the specific conditions of that particular morning. Calories were the practical engine of everything else. Without sufficient energy intake, nothing else the day demanded was possible. The travel, the tool work, the child rearing, the carrying, the vigilance. But framing Stone Age foraging purely in terms of caloric desperation misses something important. The evidence, both archaeological and ethnographic, suggests considerable variability in how food-stressed any given group was at any given time. Some periods and places offered genuine abundance. Others were genuinely lean, and most fell somewhere in between, shaped by season, region, ecological knowledge and luck. The image of Stone Age humans perpetually on the edge of starvation is more a product of our own anxieties than of the actual record. What the record shows more accurately is skilled people moving through landscapes they understood deeply, extracting nutrition from a remarkable diversity of sources. That diversity is worth dwelling on because it tends to get flattened in popular imagination into a simple picture of hunters chasing big animals. In reality, the menu was far broader. Plants formed a substantial part of the diet across most environments and time periods, not just obvious fruits, but seeds, nuts, roots, tubers, bulbs, and greens. Nuts, in particular, offered dense caloric return for the effort of collecting them. Tubers buried underground could be dug out with sharpened sticks and provided both carbohydrates and hydration. Shellfish, where available, were extraordinarily productive. Coastal and riverine sites show evidence of shellfish collection going back hundreds of thousands of years, and Midden's ancient refuse heaps of discarded shells testify to just how much of a dietary contribution mollusks made in those environments. Insects, which most modern Western audiences instinctively recoil from, were likely a routine protein source in many regions. Eggs, raided from bird nests at the right time of year, were a windfall. Small game, rabbits, lizards, rodents, birds, was pursued and trapped with methods requiring far less coordination and risk than large mammal hunting. The day's search for food was often a combination of all of these, layered together according to what the landscape offered in that particular season. And seasonality was everything. A morning in late summer looked nothing like a morning in early spring, and a skilled forager understood that difference at a level of granularity we've largely lost. The question wasn't just what is edible in some abstract sense, but what is ready now in this specific place, given the temperature patterns of the past few weeks. Wild plants follow ripening cycles that can shift by days or weeks depending on conditions. Animal behavior changes with breeding seasons, migration patterns, and the availability of water. A group that understood when the fish would be running, when the berry patches in a particular valley would peak, when certain animals would congregate at a known waterhole, that group was operating from an information advantage as valuable as any physical skill. Arriving at a resource too early meant nothing to harvest. Arriving too late meant competing with everything else in the landscape that had already been there. This is where the concept of ecological knowledge becomes so central to understanding the Stone Age day. The work of finding food wasn't primarily about physical exertion, though that mattered. It was fundamentally about knowing where to look, what signs to read, and how to interpret evidence that wasn't immediately obvious. A skilled gatherer wasn't just walking and picking things up. They were reading the landscape, noticing which animal trails had been recently used, which plants were near the stage of ripeness that made them worth collecting, which patches of disturbed ground might indicate underground tubers, which trees showed signs of bird nesting activity. Tracks, scat, patterns in vegetation, the behavior of insects, the way other animals moved through the environment, all of it was meaningful, and the ability to read it accurately was a cognitive skill developed over years of attentive practice. The same principle applied to landscape memory. Groups who moved through the same territories repeatedly built up detailed mental maps of where specific resources clustered, how those resources varied from year to year, and which routes connected them most efficiently. A person who had been moving through a particular landscape since childhood carried an enormous body of localized knowledge that couldn't be improvised. This is one reason why territorial displacement, being pushed out of a known landscape by conflict or environmental change, was genuinely catastrophic. It wasn't just the loss of familiar ground, it was the loss of the accumulated spatial knowledge that made efficient foraging possible. For all of this, physical fitness clearly mattered. Walking long distances, digging, climbing, carrying loads, the body doing the foraging was under genuine physical demands, and archaeological evidence from skeletal remains consistently shows patterns of muscular development and wear consistent with hard physical activity. But fitness alone didn't make someone a good forager. A young person new to the landscape, however strong, was at a real disadvantage compared to an older person who carried decades of ecological reading in their memory. This is one reason why elders in foraging societies consistently occupy important roles as knowledge holders, not despite their reduced physical capacity, but because the value of what they know often exceeds what any amount of physical energy can substitute for. The stereotype of Stone Age hunger, the gaunt, desperate figure gnawing whatever can be found, probably applies to some periods and some situations, but it shouldn't define the picture. There's evidence from skeletal remains across various prehistoric populations of reasonably robust health, including dental health, suggesting varied and adequate diets. Some archaeologists have argued, drawing on ethnographic parallels, that successful foragers in productive environments may have worked fewer hours to meet caloric needs than agriculturalists who came later. A controversial claim, but one worth holding onto as a counterweight to the assumption that earlier always meant harder. The introduction of farming didn't straightforwardly improve human health or reduce human labor. In many cases, it narrowed the diet and intensified the work. The forager's diversity was a form of resilience. Still, uncertainty was always present. A morning's search could end in plenty or in very little, and that variability was simply part of the texture of the life. What made it manageable wasn't eliminating the uncertainty, but building systems, social systems of sharing, ecological knowledge that reduced wasted effort. The broad dietary range that meant failure in one category rarely meant failure across all of them. The search for food began early because it had to. But it began not in desperation, in most cases, but in competence. The quiet, practiced competence of people who knew exactly what kind of morning this was and what it was likely to offer. When we think about the plant side of that foraging equation, it's tempting to imagine something almost passive, people wandering through a landscape, plucking whatever happens to catch their eye. The reality was almost certainly the opposite. Gathering edible plants was a technical discipline, built on years of accumulated knowledge, fine-grained timing, and a level of ecological literacy that most people today simply don't possess. It wasn't a fallback when hunting failed. In many environments and across many seasons, it was the foundation that everything else rested on. Consider what it actually takes to gather plants safely and efficiently. First, you have to know what's edible at all, and that knowledge is less obvious than it sounds. Many plants that are edible at one stage of their development are toxic at another. Some roots that are perfectly nutritious when cooked become harmful when eaten raw. Certain berries that will feed you are nearly identical in appearance to species that will make you violently ill or kill you outright. Distinguishing them reliably required knowledge built up over generations, taught through close observation and guided practice, not through trial and error. The stakes of error were too high for that. A skilled gatherer wasn't just identifying plants, they were reading them, assessing ripeness, checking for signs of disease or contamination, judging whether the conditions had been right for safe consumption. Timing was equally critical. Many of the most calorie-dense plant foods, nuts, seeds, certain roots, have windows of peak availability that are measured in weeks, sometimes days. Miss the window and the resource is gone until the following year. A successful gatherer had to know, based on reading the accumulated signals of the season, not just where a resource existed, but precisely when to return for it. This wasn't a skill you could develop from a single year of observation. It required years of moving through the same landscapes, building mental records of how conditions translated into timing. A wet spring, an early frost, a particularly warm stretch of weeks, and what those factors meant for when specific resources would peak. The knowledge was genuinely complex, and it was genuinely hard-won. It's worth saying something here about who held this knowledge and who did this work. Ethnographic records from foraging societies show considerable variation in how labor divided between gathering and hunting, but one consistent pattern stands out. Gathering was typically work in which women, elders, and children participated actively and centrally. In many groups, women with young children contributed the majority of the reliable daily caloric intake through gathering, while hunting provided a less predictable but protein-rich supplement. Elders who could no longer cover the distances required for active hunting often remained crucial to the group's survival precisely because they carried the deepest knowledge of plant resources, where specific patches grew, which species required what preparation, how to read landscape signs that younger people hadn't yet learned to notice. These aren't universal rules, and we should be cautious about projecting any single ethnographic model backward across all of human prehistory. But the evidence strongly suggests that gathering was not marginal, secondary, or unskilled. It was at the center of daily subsistence, and the people who excelled at it were valued accordingly. None of this even touches on the processing work, which was substantial. Gathering plants was only the beginning. Many of the most nutritious foods required significant effort before they were edible. Tubers had to be dug out of hard ground with digging sticks, work that was genuinely physically demanding, especially in dry or compacted soils. Nuts had to be cracked, which required both appropriate tools and the knowledge of which methods worked for which species. Some plant foods contained compounds that made them difficult to digest or mildly toxic in large quantities, and soaking them in water for extended periods could neutralize those effects, a discovery that had to be made and remembered and passed on. Seeds had to be separated from chaff through a combination of grinding, winnowing, and patient effort. Certain roots and leafy plants, bitter or fibrous in their raw state, became nutritious and palatable only after prolonged processing. Carrying all of this back to camp added another layer of physical work on top of the collecting itself, and the design of carrying vessels, whether woven baskets, skin pouches, or other containers, likely represented one of the most important technological developments of the period, even if it's one that leaves almost no archaeological trace. What all this processing meant in practical terms was that gathering didn't end when the plants were in hand. It continued at camp, woven into the activity of the afternoon and evening, often as communal work that combined productivity with social exchange. Women grinding seeds, cracking nuts, sorting roots, these tasks could be done while talking, while watching children, while passing information about where the good patches were and what had been seen in the landscape that day. The caloric and nutritional returns on gathering, when done well, could be substantial. Tubers in many environments provided reliable carbohydrate energy across seasons when other foods were scarce. Nuts, where available, delivered impressive caloric density per unit of effort. Leafy plants and fruits contributed vitamins and minerals that rounded out a diet otherwise dominated by animal protein. In many environments, a skilled gatherer working a well-known landscape could meet a significant portion of a group's daily caloric needs with reasonable consistency, arguably more consistently than hunters, whose returns were more variable by nature. This reliability was the crucial advantage. It meant that even on days when hunting produced nothing, the group wasn't necessarily going hungry. Children were almost certainly part of this work from early ages, not as a burden but as genuine contributors and learners. Young children accompanying adults on gathering trips would begin absorbing plant identification and landscape knowledge long before they could articulate it formally. They would watch which plants were selected and which were passed over, observe how adults assessed ripeness, learn by imitation before they learned by instruction. By the time they were adolescents, they would likely already hold substantial practical knowledge that had accumulated through thousands of hours of embedded participation. This is one reason why childhood in foraging societies functioned so differently from the modern Western conception. It wasn't a protected period of separation from adult activity, but an extended apprenticeship conducted in the real world, with real consequences and real contributions. A 10-year-old in a foraging group who knew the landscape well was genuinely useful. not symbolically helpful. The picture that emerges, taken together, is of gathering as a cognitively demanding, physically substantial, technically sophisticated form of work, one that required memory, ecological knowledge, careful judgment, and significant processing effort, and one that delivered reliable nutrition in return. The assumption that hunting was the serious, skilled, masculine work of the Stone Age, while gathering was something simpler and secondary, gets the evidence almost exactly backward in many contexts. Gathering was the backbone of daily subsistence across most environments and most seasons, performed by some of the most knowledgeable members of the group and taught to children with the same care and patience that any essential skill demands. That said, hunting was real, it was important, and in certain environments and seasons it could be the difference between nutritional sufficiency and serious hardship. But if gathering gets underestimated in popular imagination, hunting tends to get misrepresented in the opposite direction, romanticized into something more dramatic, more individual, and more reliably successful than the evidence actually supports. The reality was messier, slower, and far more uncertain than the image of a lone hunter bringing down a mammoth would suggest. Start with the basic question of what a Stone Age hunter was actually trying to catch on any given day, because the answer matters. Large game, the mammoths, aurochs, red deer, bison, and other megafauna that tend to dominate depictions of prehistoric hunting, represented significant caloric prizes when successfully taken. But they were also rare targets, difficult to find, difficult to approach, and genuinely dangerous to attack. For many groups across many seasons, small game was far more likely to be on the menu. Rabbits, birds, fish, turtles, small mammals, reptiles, insects. Catching a rabbit doesn't make for much of a cave painting, but it could make for a meaningful contribution to the day's food. Small game hunting and trapping required its own set of skills and knowledge, and it probably occupied hunters' time far more often than the pursuit of large animals. Snares and traps in particular represent a technology whose importance tends to be invisible in the archaeological record, but was likely substantial. A well-placed snare works while you sleep, and a hunter who knew how to read animal trails and set traps effectively could generate returns with relatively low risk. When larger animals were the target, the planning involved was qualitatively different. Before anyone threw a spear or drew close enough to use a thrusting weapon, there was the work of finding animals in the first place. Tracking, reading footprints, disturbed vegetation, droppings, feeding signs, the subtle compression of soil that tells you how recently an animal passed and in what direction was an extraordinarily sophisticated skill. Researchers who have studied contemporary tracking experts in foraging societies describe it as a form of inference that operates almost like a scientific method, forming hypotheses from fragmentary evidence, testing them against new signs, revising conclusions, building a picture of an animal's behavior from indirect traces it left hours or days before. It demanded close attention, accumulated experience, and the ability to hold a complex mental model of an animal's movement and likely location across a landscape. Hunters who could do this well were invaluable to their groups, and the knowledge was almost certainly taught and passed on with the same seriousness as plant knowledge. Once an animal was located, the approach was its own discipline. Wind direction mattered enormously. Animals with keen senses of smell would detect a hunter from a considerable distance if the wind was wrong. Moving quietly through vegetation required both deliberate technique and the kind of environmental familiarity that comes only from moving through the same landscapes repeatedly. Depending on the terrain and the species, hunters might use natural cover, they might attempt a slow stalk over considerable distance, or they might set up an ambush along a route the animal was likely to use. In some cases, particularly for herd animals, groups may have worked together to drive animals toward natural obstacles, cliff edges, bogs, river crossings, or confined terrain, where they could be dispatched more safely and efficiently. These kinds of coordinated hunts required communication, planning, and the ability to execute as a team in conditions that were unpredictable and often chaotic. The weapons themselves varied considerably across time and geography, and the differences were meaningful. A thrusting spear, a long wooden shaft with a hardened or stone-tipped point, used in close contact with the animal, was effective but required getting dangerously close. The invention of throwing spears extended the distance at which a hunter could engage prey, reducing some of the risk. The atlatl, or spear thrower, which appears in the archaeological record well into the Upper Paleolithic, amplified throwing distance and force significantly, functioning as a mechanical extension of the arm. Each of these technologies represented a genuine shift in what was tactically possible, and hunters using them were not simply wielding instinct, they were applying practiced technique with tools that required skill to use accurately under pressure. Strength was part of it, certainly, but the popular image of hunting as primarily a test of physical power misses most of what actually determined success. Reading the landscape, reading the animal, controlling your own movement and scent, coordinating with companions, choosing the right moment, these were the variables that separated successful hunts from unsuccessful ones, and they were matters of knowledge and judgment as much as physical capability. And unsuccessful hunts were, by most accounts, the norm rather than the exception. Ethnographic research on contemporary and historical foraging groups consistently suggests that hunting attempts fail far more often than they succeed. Estimates vary significantly by environment and species, but it is not unusual for hunters to return empty-handed more days than not. Animals are alert, fast, and motivated by survival in ways that make them formidable targets even for experienced hunters with good tools. Wounded animals often escape and are not recovered. Promising approaches are spoiled by a shift in wind, a snapped twig, an animal that simply moved in an unexpected direction. The returns from hunting are variable in a way that gathering generally is not, which is precisely why the consistent productivity of gathering carried such importance. What did a failed hunt mean for the rest of the day? Practically, it meant that the hunters returned with nothing to show for hours of effort, tired, perhaps frustrated, and now dependent on what gatherers had brought in and what stored or processed foods remained from previous days. It did not necessarily mean hunger, especially if gathering had gone well, but it meant the high caloric animal protein that hunting provided when successful was not available. Repeated failures could create real pressure, particularly in lean seasons or in environments where plant foods were limited. And the failure wasn't purely about food. Hunting success was likely bound up with status, with the ability to provision one's group, with a social dimension that made empty hands carry a different kind of weight beyond the merely practical. All of this points toward a picture of hunting as genuinely skilled, genuinely demanding, and genuinely uncertain work, not the straightforward assertion of human dominance over the animal world that it sometimes gets depicted as, but a negotiation with a landscape and its inhabitants that required preparation, patience, ecological intelligence, and no small amount of luck. On any given day, the hunters might come home with meat that would feed the group well. Or they might come home with nothing at all, and the group would turn to what the gatherers had brought, and the day would continue. When the hunters did come home with something, when the pursuit had gone well and an animal lay dead on the ground, the work was far from over. In fact, in some ways the real labour was only beginning. What happened between the moment of the kill and the moment anyone actually ate is one of the most underappreciated chapters of prehistoric daily life, and it involved effort, skill, and coordination that could occupy hours or even the better part of a day. The first challenge was often simply getting the animal back to camp, or deciding whether to do that at all. A large animal, an aurochs, a red deer, a horse, might weigh several hundred kilograms. You cannot carry that. What Stone Age hunters almost certainly did, as ethnographic analogy strongly suggests, was make an initial assessment on the spot. How far from camp were they? How large was the animal? How many people were available? What were the risks of leaving the carcass unattended? In many cases, the practical solution was to butcher the animal where it fell, removing the most useful parts and transporting those rather than attempting to move the whole carcass. This is supported directly by the archaeological record. We find butchery sites away from main habitation areas, places where the evidence of cutting, scraping and bone breaking suggests intensive processing happened at the kill site before selected materials were carried elsewhere. Butchering itself was a skilled operation. Done efficiently with sharp stone tools, it involved knowing the anatomy of the animal well enough to work quickly and cleanly, separating muscle from bone along the right planes, avoiding the organs that would spoil quickly or contaminate the meat, working before the carcass stiffened or before scavengers arrived. Hyenas, wolves, vultures and other competitors would have been a real and present concern, and speed had survival value beyond just efficiency. Stone flakes and blades used for butchery were extraordinarily sharp, sharper in some cases than modern surgical steel, and the people using them had refined their technique through years of practice. Cut marks preserved on fossil bones give us direct evidence of how this process unfolded, where tools were applied, in what sequence, with what apparent purpose. Marrow extraction was a particularly important part of the process. Long bones, femurs, tibias, humeri contain bone marrow that is extraordinarily rich in fat, one of the most calorie-dense foods available in a pre-agricultural world. Getting to it required breaking the bones open, which meant selecting the right stones, applying force in the right places, and knowing which bones were worth the effort. The cracked and percussion-marked bones we find at prehistoric sites tell us this was done systematically, not incidentally. Fat was not a dietary villain in this world, it was a precious resource, a concentrated energy source in an environment where getting enough calories required constant effort. Marrow wasn't a byproduct, it was a prize. Hide removal was another significant undertaking. Animal skin, properly processed, is one of the most versatile materials available to a hunter-gatherer group. It can become clothing, shelter covering, carrying bags, pouches, thongs, cord and bedding. But getting from fresh hide to useful material is not a simple step. The hide had to be removed cleanly from the carcass, a process requiring careful cutting to avoid punctures that would compromise the final product, and then processed before it dried out and stiffened into unusable rawhide. This meant scraping away fat and connective tissue from the inner surface, a laborious task usually performed with a specific type of stone scraper. The scale of hide scraping evident at some prehistoric sites implies it was a regular, time-consuming activity, and the tools designed for it show signs of sustained use and deliberate design. All of this connects butchering not just to food but to toolmaking and material culture more broadly. Bones were raw material as much as they were food containers. Split bone yielded points, awls, needles and handles. Tendons dried into cordage and thread. Sinew could be twisted into binding material. Antler was one of the most worked substances in Upper Paleolithic Europe, shaped into projectile points, hooks and handles. Nothing from a large animal was likely wasted by people operating without storage beyond what they could preserve by drying, smoking or freezing in cold climates. The carcass was not just a meal, it was a materials depot, and processing it fully required knowing what each part could become. Fire played a central role in transforming raw materials into usable ones. Cooking meat made it safer, made it easier to digest, and in some cases extended how long it could be kept, rendering fat over heat-extracted oils that could be stored, used as fuel for lamps, applied to skin and hides, or consumed directly. Bones heated in fire would crack differently, and heat-treating stone before knapping changed its fracture properties in ways that made tool production easier, a sophisticated bit of pyrotechnology that required knowing the right temperatures and timing. The hearth was not simply a warming device, it was a processing center around which much of the transformation from raw to usable happened. Carrying was its own solved problem. Meat, marrow, hide, bone, plant foods gathered earlier in the day. All of this had to be transported, and human hands alone are limited. Bags, baskets, and containers made from hide, bark, or plant fiber were almost certainly in use, though these organic materials rarely survive for archaeologists to find directly. But the logic is inescapable. People who regularly transported significant quantities of materials across landscapes needed containers to do it efficiently, and the cognitive and technical capacity to produce such things was clearly present. A hide bag might carry plant foods, raw meat, or collected nuts. The same material that provided clothing also provided the means of moving food. What's striking about all of this when you lay it out is how thoroughly it was a collective endeavor. The hunters brought back the animal or its processed parts, but the work of butchering, hide preparation, marrow extraction and cooking was almost certainly distributed across the group, shared by people of different ages and roles, with the more skilled tasks falling to those with the most experience and the less specialized labor shared more broadly. Children watching adults butcher an animal weren't just bystanders, they were apprentices, absorbing knowledge that would take years to fully develop. The division between obtaining food and preparing it was not a sharp line but a continuum of effort that involved most of the group in one way or another. By the time food actually reached mouths, it had passed through a remarkable chain of human intelligence, physical effort, and collaborative action. The distance between the animal on the landscape and the meal at the hearth was bridged by knowledge of anatomy, mastery of stone tools, command of fire, skill in hide working, understanding of materials, and the coordinated labor of people working together toward a shared outcome. A Stone Age meal was not simply caught and eaten. It was, in a meaningful sense, manufactured, transformed from raw resource into sustenance and materials through a process that was, by any honest measure, sophisticated work. In a camp where nearly everything required collective effort, children were not a separate category of life managed in parallel to the real business of the day. They were woven into it, present at the hearth, while adults worked nearby during food preparation, carried on bodies during movement, watched by whoever was available. The idea of childhood as a distinct protected sphere, cordoned off from adult concerns, is a remarkably recent invention. For most of human history, and almost certainly throughout the Stone Age, children existed inside daily life rather than alongside it. Infants presented the most immediate logistical challenge. A newborn in a hunter-gatherer band is entirely dependent, entirely immobile, and entirely demanding of warmth and feeding, and yet the group still had to function. The most likely solution, supported by both comparative primate behavior and extensive ethnographic documentation from modern foraging societies, is that infants were carried almost continuously, held against the body in some form of wrap or sling. Skin-to-skin contact would have regulated their temperature in environments without reliable shelter heating, and constant proximity to an adult body meant feeding on demand rather than on schedule, a pattern that remains universal among foraging peoples studied in the 20th and 21st centuries. An infant left in one place while its mother foraged would have been a liability in a world that included predators, temperature extremes, and the simple danger of being out of sight. Carrying was not sentimentality. It was practical survival logic. What made infant care sustainable in these conditions was almost certainly not that one person carried all of it. Ethnographic studies of contemporary and historically documented hunter-gatherer groups reveal a pattern researchers call alloparenting, the sharing of childcare responsibilities across multiple adults and older children in the group, not just the biological mother. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and non-related group members all participate in holding, watching, and caring for infants and young children. This has led some researchers to argue that cooperative child-rearing may be one of the defining features of human social evolution, that our unusually long childhoods and high offspring survival rates were made possible precisely because the work was distributed. A single mother attempting to provide everything her infant needed, while also contributing to foraging and food processing, would face nearly impossible demands. A mother embedded in a network of caregivers was in a fundamentally different situation. As children grew old enough to move independently, they didn't graduate into a separate children's zone. They moved with the group, observed the group's activities, and began the long process of imitation that is the engine of skill transmission in non-literate societies. Watch a young child in any foraging community, and what you see is an apprentice, not a formal one with structured lessons, but an observer who is absorbing, testing, and copying everything around them. A 4-year-old handling a small stone, trying to strike it the way adults do. A 6-year-old helping scrape a hide, mimicking the grip and angle. A child who tags along on a gathering walk, learning which plants are which, not through instruction, but through repeated exposure and observation. Play and work existed on a continuum rather than as separate activities. The games children played, throwing, tracking, building, imitating, were also practice for everything they would eventually need to do as adults. This kind of learning through living is extraordinarily effective, and it's efficient in a way that formal teaching is not. Knowledge doesn't need to be extracted from lived experience and delivered in structured sessions, it simply transmits through participation. A child who spends years watching adults process animals, make tools, identify plants, and navigate social dynamics is accumulating a vast and nuanced body of knowledge long before anyone would describe them as trained. The archaeological record supports this. We find small, imperfect tools that appear to be the products of learning hands, flakes napped by someone who hadn't yet mastered the technique, objects that don't quite work as intended, but that clearly follow the logic of adult production. Children were practicing, and that practice was happening in the same spaces where adults were doing the real thing. The realities of childhood in the Stone Age were also genuinely harsh, and there is no honest account of this period that avoids them. Infant and child mortality was high by any modern standard. Illness, accident, nutritional stress during lean seasons, the consequences of injury without effective medical intervention, all of these created a world where children were profoundly vulnerable and where the loss of a child was not an unusual event, but a recurring one. Skeletal remains from prehistoric burial sites show evidence of developmental stress, periods of illness or nutritional deficiency recorded in the structure of teeth and bones, injuries sustained in what appear to have been accidents, and deaths that came early. The emotional reality of living with this level of child mortality is something we can't measure directly, but the evidence of careful burial, of ochre and grave goods placed with children, suggests that these deaths mattered, that they were marked, that grief was real. Children also imposed constraints on the group's mobility that had to be constantly negotiated. A band that needs to cover significant ground in a day moves at the pace of its slowest members. Toddlers cannot walk the distances that adults can, and carrying them across rough terrain is exhausting. This almost certainly influenced decisions about how far to range on any given day where to establish camps, and how long to stay in one place before moving on. Nursing infants require a mother whose own caloric needs are substantially elevated. Lactation is metabolically expensive, which means that the food requirements of a camp were not evenly distributed but weighted toward those who were caring for the very young. A woman nursing a child needed more food than a woman who was not, and the group's foraging patterns would have had to account for that, even if not consciously or explicitly. What this means for reconstructing a typical day in camp is that children were not background elements, they were active variables that shaped the structure of everything else. The decision about when to move and when to stay, the allocation of who went to forage and who remained near camp, the sounds and interruptions that structured the rhythm of the afternoon. A toddler who needed attention in the middle of hide scraping didn't pause the day. The day continued around them, and whoever was nearby absorbed the task of watching. That fluidity, that constant absorption of children into the texture of adult activity, is probably the most honest image we have of how family and work existed in these communities. Not balanced against each other, but braided together in a way that modern life, with its sharp separations between domestic and productive space, has largely dismantled. Stone Age children grew up inside human knowledge. They heard the conversations, watched the techniques, felt the social dynamics of the group. By the time they were capable of performing skilled tasks, they had already spent years observing how it was done. Childhood wasn't preparation for life in that world. It was already life, lived in full from the very beginning. All of that observation children were doing, the watching, the imitation, the small hands trying to copy adult technique, was often directed at something that consumed a surprising portion of every day: the making, maintaining, and repair of tools. We tend to think of toolmaking as an event, a discrete moment when someone sat down and produced something. The archaeological record encourages this view because what survives is the finished product or the debris of production, the flakes, the cores, the shaped stone objects. What doesn't survive is time, and the honest reconstruction of a Stone Age day has to grapple with just how much of it was absorbed by technological maintenance. Consider what every other activity actually required. Hunting demanded functional projectile points, hafted securely, with the binding intact and the tip sharp enough to penetrate hide. Butchering required cutting edges that dulled quickly against bone and sinew and needed to be refreshed or replaced. Processing plant foods involved tools that wore down, cracked, or simply broke under repeated use. Building or modifying shelter required implements for cutting, scraping, and working wood. There was almost no activity in daily life that didn't depend on functional tools, and functional tools didn't maintain themselves. The hours that went into keeping everything working were hours that had to come from somewhere. Stone knapping is where the archaeological evidence is richest, and it reveals something important. This was not casual work that anyone could pick up and do adequately without training. Producing a useful stone tool, a biface, a blade, a scraper with a reliable working edge, required understanding the fracture mechanics of specific stone types, knowing how to identify and source good raw material, and having developed through years of practice the precise combination of force, angle, and platform preparation that produces a controlled, predictable flake rather than an unpredictable failure. Ethnographic observations of skilled knappers in the 20th century show that they plan their reduction sequences in advance, mentally mapping how a core should be worked before the first strike falls. The physical learning curve is steep and long. Knappers who learned from childhood, absorbing technique through observation before ever picking up a hammerstone, were accumulating a body of procedural knowledge that cannot be shortcut. The quality of available stone mattered enormously and shaped behavior in ways that extended far beyond the moment of production. Good knapping stone flint, chert, obsidian, high-quality quartzite is not universally distributed across landscapes. Where it was available, it was curated. Cores were carried, blanks were prepared in advance at quarry sites, and finished tools were transported significant distances rather than discarded casually. The presence of exotic stone materials at archaeological sites, sometimes moved hundreds of kilometers from their geological source, suggests that access to good raw material was not taken for granted. When a piece of quality stone broke unexpectedly during knapping, or when a hafted point shattered on impact during a hunt, the loss was real in a way that connects to the effort and planning that had gone into acquiring the material in the first place. But the phrase Stone Age contains a deep irony, because stone was almost certainly not the dominant material in the technological lives of the people who lived through it. It was simply the most durable. Everything else, the wood, bone, antler, shell, fibre, bark, hide, feathers, resin and plant compounds that made up the vast majority of the material world, decayed and vanished. What we call the Stone Age might more accurately be called the age of organic technology, except that almost none of that technology left a direct trace. When it does survive in waterlogged deposits or permafrost or the rare dry cave environment, the picture that emerges is startling. The Tyrolean Iceman, preserved in alpine ice for over 5,000 years, carried with him a kit of extraordinary complexity. A copper axe with a hafted handle, a bow and arrows with fletching and adhesive fixed points, a quiver, a backpack frame, multiple pouches, fire-starting materials, and clothing assembled from at least 5 different animal species. The stone components of his toolkit were only a small fraction of the whole. He was not a primitive, he was a specialist in materials management. For people living tens of thousands of years earlier, the organic dimension of daily technology was similarly rich and similarly time-consuming. Hafting a stone point to a shaft required sourcing or preparing the shaft itself, finding and processing binding material, sinew, plant fibre, rawhide, and applying some form of adhesive, since bindings alone rarely hold securely under impact stress. Archaeological evidence of compound adhesives, mixtures of birch tar, ochre, and other substances that were deliberately prepared and applied to attach tools to handles extends back at least 200,000 years in some sites. The preparation of these adhesives required knowing which materials worked, how to process them, and how to apply them correctly. This was chemistry, even if the practitioners wouldn't have used that word. Wood required its own expertise. Selecting the right species for a spear shaft meant knowing which trees grew straight, which wood had the right combination of flexibility and strength, and how to work it, straightening it with heat, scraping it smooth, tapering it correctly. Cordage made from plant fibers or animal materials had to be twisted, and the technique of twisting fiber into functional rope is itself a learned skill that takes practice to perform efficiently. Bone and antler could be shaped into points, needles, hooks and handles, but working these materials required both the right stone tools for incising and grooving and the knowledge of how animal materials respond to heat, moisture and mechanical stress. Every category of material in this world had a learning curve, and the people who worked within it carried that expertise the way any sophisticated craftsperson does as a body of internalized knowledge accumulated over years. What this means for reconstructing daily time use is that toolmaking and repair didn't occupy one designated part of the day. They were threaded through everything. A hunter returning from an unsuccessful attempt might spend part of the afternoon retouching a dulled edge or rehafting a loosened point before the next morning's effort. A woman processing hides would notice that her scraper was losing its effectiveness and stop to refresh the working edge before continuing. Someone whose binding had frayed would address it before it failed completely at a moment when failure would be costly. This kind of ongoing, distributed maintenance doesn't look like a dedicated work session. It looks like the texture of a day, the small technical attentions that kept everything functioning. And those attentions required knowledge that took a lifetime to build. The children watching from the edges of the camp, handling small stones, trying to reproduce what they saw adults doing, they were at the beginning of a long apprenticeship in a technological system of genuine complexity. The tools that survived to become museum objects were the outputs of that system. But the system itself was something else, a living, continuous practice of skilled work, dispersed across the hours of the day, invisible to the archaeological record, and essential to everything else that happened. The Stone Age was not primitive, it was technically demanding in ways that the label has never adequately captured, and the hours spent on maintenance and production were among the most cognitively intensive hours of the day. That same invisible labor, the work that doesn't survive in the record, but consumed real hours of real days, applied with equal force to one of the most fundamental technologies of human survival, clothing. It's easy to underestimate this. We picture Stone Age people draped loosely in animal skins and move on, but that image flattens something that was in practice an ongoing technical project requiring skill, time, and sustained attention. Staying warm and dry wasn't a background condition of life in many of the environments where humans lived. It was something people actively built and maintained, day after day, against relentless wear. In Ice Age Europe and Northern Asia, the urgency of this is impossible to overstate. Temperatures during glacial periods could drop to levels that would kill an unprotected human within hours. The people who survived and thrived in those environments, who pushed into the Arctic, who hunted mammoths on open steppe landscapes with bitter winters and brutal wind, did so because they had solved the insulation problem at a sophisticated level. Studies of cold weather survival physiology suggest that effective layered clothing, tailored close enough to trap body heat, is not optional above certain latitudes and at certain times of year. It's the difference between life and death within a single night. The archaeological evidence supports this conclusion. Needles made from bone and ivory, delicate, precisely made, with drilled eyes appear in the record tens of thousands of years ago. You don't make a needle unless you're sewing, and you don't sew unless you're producing fitted, seamed garments, rather than just wrapping yourself in an unshaped piece of hide. The production of those garments began long before the needle came out. It began with the animal and specifically with what happened to the hide after the butchering was done. A fresh hide is a stiff organic material that will rot, harden into an unusable board, or crack if it isn't processed correctly. Turning it into workable leather requires scraping away every trace of fat and flesh from the inner surface, a process that can take many hours even on a single hide and demands a sharp, well-maintained scraper held at exactly the right angle, applied with sustained physical effort. The hide then needs to be worked, stretched, pulled, sometimes dampened and dried repeatedly to break down the fiber structure and introduce flexibility. One widely attested method across many cultures involves working the brain tissue of the same animal into the hide, a process called brain tanning, which produces remarkably soft and pliable results. This is painstaking work. It requires knowledge of how far to push the material, how to judge when it's ready, how to finish it so it holds its quality. And then comes the cutting, the fitting, the sewing. Thread made from sinew, split from tendons into fine strands, is strong and almost invisible when dry, which is part of why stitched clothing from this period doesn't survive. The sinew dries and disintegrates, but the needles remain, and the needles tell the story. They are small enough, precise enough, that the clothing being produced must have been constructed with real attention to fit and function. Loose wraps don't require that level of finish. Tight-seamed parkas, mittens, leggings and hoods do. The kind of layered, fitted clothing that modern Arctic peoples have developed and refined over millennia, and that provides effective protection precisely because it minimizes the dead air space that cold can penetrate. Beyond the main garments, footwear deserves its own consideration. Walking the distances that foragers walked, often 10 to 15 miles or more in a day across varied terrain, in inadequate foot coverings is not just uncomfortable but dangerous. Blistered, wet or frostbitten feet can incapacitate a person within days in cold or rough environments. Well-made moccasins or wrapped foot coverings, sized and shaped correctly, stuffed with insulating plant material for cold conditions, were functional technology in the most direct sense. They required the same hide preparation, the same careful sewing, the same ongoing attention and repair as any other element of a person's material kit. They also wore out, constantly. Anyone walking significant distances on rough ground through all seasons would have gone through footwear at a rate that demanded regular production. Add to this the carrying gear, bags, pouches, wraps for infants, containers made from hide or gut, and the picture of clothing work expands further. Infants and young children in cold climates needed to be kept warm against an adult body, which meant carrier systems that held them securely and enclosed them protectively. In Arctic conditions observed among recent foraging peoples, mothers and babies share a single garment space, the baby held against skin inside the mother's outer layer, which is itself a specific design feature requiring a specific kind of construction. The care of children and the construction of clothing were not separate concerns. They were the same concern addressed through the same set of technical skills. All of this points to something important about where the hours went. When the hunters were out, when the food processors were working, the people who were tending fires, watching children, and also continuously working hides and skins were doing something that took as long as it took and couldn't be skipped. A garment that was falling apart at a seam would fail at a bad moment if not repaired. A scraper worn too dull to clean a hide properly would produce inferior results that shortened the garment's life. The whole system required maintenance attention distributed across the available time, threaded between other tasks, picked up and set down and returned to in the way that any ongoing project of real importance gets managed. There's also reason to think that clothing was not purely functional in a narrow sense. Across the archaeological record of the Upper Paleolithic, there is evidence of ochre applied to hides and furs, of shell beads sewn onto garments, of deliberate choices about materials and decorative treatment that go beyond keeping the cold out. This shouldn't surprise us. Clothing signals identity in virtually every human culture we know of. It marks age, status, group membership, and individual distinction. If Stone Age clothing carried any of that social meaning, and there's no particular reason to think it didn't, then the work of making it carried a corresponding weight. You weren't just producing insulation, you were producing something that said something about the person who wore it, and perhaps about the person who made it. The hours spent scraping, softening, cutting and sewing were hours that shaped survival, shaped mobility, shaped the well-being of children, and possibly shaped how people were seen by one another. They were quiet hours in many reconstructions of prehistoric life, interior hours, work done near the fire or at the edge of camp, but quiet doesn't mean marginal. The people doing this work were holding the group together as surely as the hunters bringing in protein or the gatherers returning with plants. The needle moving through sinew, the hide yielding under repeated working, the finished garment that would keep someone alive through a winter night, these were not afterthoughts of the Stone Age day. They were its substance. All that work, the scraping, sewing, carrying, processing, rarely happened in silence. And that matters more than it might seem. One of the things that distinguishes human survival from the survival strategies of other animals isn't just the tools or the clothing or the cooperative hunting. It's the conversation running alongside all of it, the social layer that wrapped around every task. Because for Stone Age humans, information was a resource just as real as meat or flint, and exchanging it was something they were almost certainly doing constantly. Think about what a small group of foragers actually needed to know: where the animals were moving, which plants were fruiting and where, which water source had gone dry, who had seen what and when and how far away. In a landscape that changed seasonally, where knowledge could be the difference between finding food and coming back empty, the people who talked, who reported what they'd seen, who listened carefully, who remembered what someone had mentioned 3 days ago, had a meaningful advantage over those who didn't. Information sharing wasn't a social nicety layered on top of real survival work. It may have been survival work, just in a form that leaves almost nothing in the archaeological record. Language itself is part of that picture. We can't know exactly when fully modern language capacity emerged, and that debate continues in the literature. But by the time we're looking at behaviorally modern humans in the Upper Paleolithic, people making art, trading materials across long distances, constructing complex social networks, there's good reason to think language was doing heavy lifting in daily life. Not just to coordinate a hunt or direct someone to a resource location, but to transmit knowledge across time, to explain why something works the way it does, to describe something that happened yesterday or last season or before you were born. That capacity to reach backward and forward in time through speech is one of the things that makes human knowledge cumulative rather than perpetually reinvented. Teaching is where this becomes vivid. Across the small-scale societies that anthropologists have studied, formal instruction in the sense of scheduled lessons is mostly absent. What exists instead is something more constant and more woven into the texture of daily activity: demonstration, imitation, correction, commentary. A child watches an adult nap a flint, not because they've been told to sit down and pay attention, but because they're there, and what's happening is interesting, and eventually they pick up a piece of stone and try it themselves. The adult might redirect their grip, or take the tool back and show the motion again, or simply let them make a mess of it and observe. This is how skills transmitted, not through instruction manuals, not through classrooms, but through proximity and repetition, and the gradual iterative process of trying and failing and watching someone who already knows. Storytelling almost certainly played a role in this as well. Not necessarily as formalized performance, though that may have existed too, but as the natural mode through which experience got shared. You came back from a foraging trip, and you described what you saw. You explained where the path turned difficult, what the sky looked like before the weather changed, what animal sign you read, and what it meant. Embedded in those descriptions was practical knowledge, transmitted in a form that was engaging and memorable precisely because it was narrative. The story format isn't just entertaining, it's easier to remember than a list of facts. A brain that evolved in social groups, listening to other people's experiences, is a brain that's reasonably well designed to retain information when it comes packaged with characters and sequence and consequence. Then there's the question of food sharing, which sits at the center of how small-scale foraging societies organize their social lives. In most of the foraging groups that have been studied, large game, when it's brought in, doesn't belong exclusively to the hunters who killed it. It gets distributed through a web of obligations and expectations and norms that vary in their specifics, but tend toward the same general logic. You share because the group's collective survival depends on it. You share because next week the hunters might come back empty, and you'll be glad someone else succeeded. You share because failure to share carries social costs in reputation, in standing, in the willingness of others to cooperate with you in the future. Reciprocity in this context isn't altruism exactly, and it isn't selfishness exactly. It's a social technology for managing the unpredictability of a food supply that swings wildly between abundance and scarcity. This doesn't mean sharing was frictionless or automatic. In virtually every foraging society observed, debates about distribution are a recurring feature of social life. Who got the best cut? Whether someone contributed their fair share? Whether the rules were being applied consistently? These conversations, sometimes quiet, sometimes heated, are how the norms get maintained and negotiated. Inequity in sharing is a recognized source of tension, and the social pressure to correct it is real and regularly applied. People notice, they remember, they talk, which leads to the part of social life that's easiest to either romanticize away or exaggerate in the other direction: conflict. The evidence from skeletal remains includes injuries consistent with interpersonal violence, and there's no reason to pretend that Stone Age groups were free of it. But there's also no reason to picture life as dominated by it. What the ethnographic record of foragers suggests most consistently is that conflict management was an active social project. Small groups couldn't afford to let disputes escalate unchecked. The costs of fracture were too high when everyone depended on everyone else. So the social tools available, mediation, humor, public teasing that deflects tension, the option of simply moving away from a person you couldn't get along with, got used. Dominance competition existed, jealousy existed, grievances accumulated and occasionally erupted. But the groups that survived were likely the ones that developed some capacity to navigate those pressures without destroying the cooperation that kept them alive. Social intelligence in this light wasn't a soft skill running in the background of a life defined by physical challenges. It was central, knowing how to read the group's mood, knowing when to push and when to step back, knowing who was reliable, who could be trusted with what, who was owed something and who owed you. Managing those relationships required attention and effort every bit as real as managing a hide or tracking an animal. The person who was socially skilled, who could resolve disputes without creating new ones, who knew how to teach without humiliating, who shared in ways that built goodwill rather than resentment, was probably a valuable person to have in any group, and likely knew it. The rhythm of the day, then, wasn't just structured by hunger and weather and physical task. It was structured by talk, by the constant low hum of social life that ran through everything, the teaching that happened while hands were busy, the negotiation of shares that followed a successful hunt, the stories told while someone worked a hide by firelight, the quarrel that broke out and had to be addressed before it curdled into something worse. None of this left much in the ground, but it shaped every hour. The social fabric of daily life didn't exist in one fixed place. It moved, and understanding how Stone Age humans actually spent their days requires grappling with something that modern life has almost entirely erased from our intuitions. Many of these people were, in a fundamental sense, walkers. Not walkers in the recreational sense, walking as leisure, walking as exercise, but walking as the basic mechanism by which survival was organized across space and time. The landscape wasn't a backdrop to their lives. It was the medium they moved through constantly, and knowing how to read it, remember it, and navigate it efficiently was as essential as any other skill they possessed. For most hunter-gatherer groups, mobility wasn't optional. It was the strategy. The logic behind it is elegant and stark. If you stay in one place long enough, you use it up. The game moves away or grows wary. The edible plants get picked out. The water source drops in dry season. The firewood within easy reach gets burned. Staying too long in one location meant diminishing returns, and diminishing returns for people operating without surplus storage or supply chains eventually meant hunger. So you moved, not randomly, not desperately, but as part of an ongoing negotiation between where the resources were now and where they were likely to be next. How far people actually walked in a day varied enormously depending on whether they were traveling between camps or working locally. On a foraging day with the group settled in a productive area, individuals might range anywhere from a few kilometers to perhaps 15 or more depending on the terrain and what they were pursuing. On a travel day, when the decision had been made to relocate camp entirely, the distance could be greater, though it would be shaped by who was making the journey. A band moving with young children, elderly members, and everything they owned wasn't moving fast. The pace of a group is the pace of its slowest members, and the carrying burden was real. What's worth sitting with is the knowledge required to make any of this work. These weren't people wandering through an undifferentiated landscape, hoping to stumble across what they needed. The territories that foraging groups occupied, and the territories adjacent to those which they might enter in times of scarcity or through seasonal rounds, were known in extraordinary detail. Landmarks served as orientation points and reference anchors in the same way that street signs and GPS coordinates serve now. A particular rock formation, the way a valley bent at a certain angle, a tree that grew in an unusual configuration. These things were remembered and used. Water sources in particular were critical knowledge. Knowing where water could reliably be found, which sources ran year-round and which dried in summer, which were accessible versus hidden or difficult, that information was survival relevant at a level that's hard to overstate in dry or variable climates. This knowledge wasn't just individual, it was collective and transgenerational. One of the functions of the storytelling and social communication discussed earlier was almost certainly the transmission of landscape knowledge across generations, descriptions of places that the young hadn't yet visited, routes through difficult terrain that grandparents had learned from their own grandparents, locations of resources that were only relevant in particular seasons or particular years. The landscape, in this sense, was encoded in the group's memory in a way that outlasted any individual's experience of it. Moving camp was a major undertaking, and it's worth trying to actually picture what it involved. Everything you owned had to be carried. For most mobile foragers, this meant possessions were deliberately limited. People owned what they could transport, and no more. Tools, hides, containers, fire-making materials, perhaps items of social or symbolic significance, these made the journey. The logic that shaped toolmaking and hide-working also shaped what it made sense to keep. You didn't accumulate objects you couldn't move with, which meant the material world of a mobile forager was organized around portability in ways that look almost brutal by modern standards, but reflect a ruthlessly coherent set of priorities. Children who weren't yet capable of walking the required distances were carried by mothers primarily, but in most well-documented foraging contexts, by others in the group as well. An infant might spend most of early life in close physical contact with an adult body, carried in some form of sling or wrap, which itself had implications for infant survival and the thermal regulation that clothing and body heat provided. Older children who could walk but tired quickly were sometimes carried for portions of a journey. Elderly or injured group members who couldn't keep pace presented a different kind of challenge, one that groups handled in ways we can only partially reconstruct, but that likely varied considerably depending on circumstance, resource availability, and the specific social dynamics of the group. Not every day involved this kind of relocation. It's important to resist the image of these groups as perpetually in motion. There would have been days, possibly extended stretches of days, when the group remained in one place because the resources around them were adequate, the weather was unfavorable for travel, someone was sick or injured, or the calculus simply favored staying put. These periods of relative stillness would have had a different texture to daily life. More time for tool production and repair, more extended social interaction, perhaps more opportunities for the kind of intensive food processing and hideworking that required sustained effort in one location. The rhythm of forager life probably alternated between these two modes more than it committed permanently to either. What distinguished a day of travel from a day of local foraging wasn't just the distance covered but the cognitive and physical demands involved. Route finding, managing the group's pace, making decisions about where to stop, watching for signs that conditions ahead were favorable or unfavorable, these were demanding tasks that required experienced judgment. The person who knew this landscape best, who had traveled these routes before, and remembered what last season had looked like here, was the person whose knowledge shaped the group's choices. That kind of practical geographic expertise was earned through years of attention and accumulated experience, and it was probably recognized and valued as such. There's something almost counterintuitive about the picture that emerges when you put all of this together. We tend to associate the Stone Age with a kind of forced simplicity. People confined to immediate environments, trapped in small worlds by the limits of their technology. But mobility, properly understood, was a form of geographic sophistication. These were people whose knowledge of landscape extended across tens or hundreds of kilometers. Who understood seasonal cycles across that entire range? Who carried in their minds a detailed layered map of terrain, water, game, plants, weather patterns, and social connections with other groups that might be encountered along the way. Moving camp wasn't an admission of failure or desperation. In most cases, it was the plan working exactly as intended, an adaptive response to a dynamic landscape executed by people who understood that landscape well enough to navigate it effectively. The day that involved relocating camp was hard and demanding, but it was also an expression of competence, of knowing from experience and inherited knowledge that better was possible somewhere else, and knowing how to get there. All of that movement, all of that skill and geographic knowledge existed within a world that could turn dangerous with very little warning. And this is where it's worth stepping back from the picture of competence and adaptability which is accurate, and acknowledging something equally true. Life in the Stone Age carried with it a constant background hum of risk that most people living in the modern world have essentially no frame of reference for. Not dramatic movie-style risk, not the kind where danger arrives in a single climactic moment. More often it was quieter than that, more ordinary. A cut from a stone flake that became infected because there were no antibiotics and wounds in active, dirty environments don't stay clean. A twisted ankle on uneven terrain that in a world without medical care meant days or weeks of reduced mobility, and reduced mobility for people whose survival depended on movement and physical contribution wasn't just painful. It was a genuine threat to both the individual and, to a lesser degree, the group that had to compensate for them. A broken bone, depending on which bone and how badly it broke, could be a death sentence, or it could heal reasonably well with good improvised care and strong social support. The skeletal record shows both outcomes. We have ancient remains with healed fractures that suggest someone survived a serious injury, which also suggests someone else helped them through it. We have other remains that tell darker stories. Dental pain deserves particular attention because it's easy to overlook and the evidence for it is substantial. Tooth decay, abscesses, worn enamel from a diet that included grit from stone grinding, infections that could spread from an untreated cavity into the jaw and beyond. These weren't rare exceptional events. They were recurring features of life. There's no good reason to think Stone Age people were immune to toothaches. There's every reason to think they lived with them, sometimes for extended periods, in a way that would be considered intolerable by modern standards, but had to be tolerated because there was no alternative. Chronic pain of this kind has real effects on behavior, mood, energy, and capacity to function. It was part of the texture of ordinary days for at least some people in these groups, some of the time. Exhaustion, too, was a real and underappreciated pressure. The kind of physical output required to forage, hunt, process food, make tools, travel, and manage the demands of camp life, sustained across weeks and seasons with variable nutrition and interrupted sleep, produces a cumulative tiredness that rest doesn't always fully reverse. Researchers studying modern forager populations have found that caloric balance can be surprisingly tight in lean periods, meaning people are sometimes working hard while operating on insufficient energy. That combination of high output and inadequate input has physiological consequences that compound over time. And then there were predators. This is a subject that tends to drift toward either extreme, either the Stone Age world was a non-stop gauntlet of animal attacks, or predators were easily managed and barely worth mentioning. Neither picture is accurate. The realistic version is somewhere in the middle, and in some ways more unsettling because of its ambiguity. Large carnivores, lions, hyenas, leopards, wolves, cave bears, depending on the period and region, shared the same landscapes and the same prey animals that foraging groups depended on. They were real presences. Fire was likely a significant deterrent, and this is one reason that fire maintenance through the night was probably taken seriously. Moving in groups was another layer of protection, making noise. Reading behavioral signs in animals well enough to avoid surprise encounters. These weren't passive strategies, they were active, practiced approaches to managing a danger that was persistent but not necessarily constant. The encounters that did happen, though, could be devastating. An attack by a large predator in a world without emergency medicine was likely fatal or severely injuring. Evidence of predator activity on hominin remains exists in the archaeological record, marks on bones that tell a clear enough story. And beyond direct attack, there was competition. Carnivores at the same kill site, trying to displace a group from a carcass they'd worked hard to bring down. That was a real scenario requiring decision-making under pressure. When do you hold your ground? When do you yield and cut your losses? That calculus required both courage and judgment, and getting it wrong in either direction had costs. Dangerous prey presented its own category of risk, distinct from predators. A wounded large animal, a bison, an aurochs, a wild boar, something with the mass and pain-driven aggression to do serious harm, was not a simple thing to finish. The final moments of a hunt, when proximity was unavoidable, were likely some of the most dangerous moments in a forager's working life. The skeletal trauma record from early human populations shows patterns of injury consistent with close quarters encounters with large animals. This wasn't speculation, it was written into bone. Weather and environmental pressure operated on a different timescale, but with no less severity. A sudden storm in exposed terrain, a cold snap that arrived before shelter was properly established, a drought that depleted water sources faster than expected, a season in which the animals simply didn't come through the pass where they were expected. These were real, recurring threats. The margin between adequate resources and not enough was sometimes thin enough that a single bad season could mean genuine hardship, illness from weakened immune systems, and elevated mortality. Climate variability across the Pleistocene was substantial, and the populations living through it didn't have the option of importing food from elsewhere or adjusting a thermostat. What kept these risks from being constantly lethal? And they clearly weren't constantly lethal, because people survived, populations persisted, knowledge accumulated across generations, was a combination of caution, accumulated knowledge, and group interdependence. Knowing which plants caused illness, knowing where not to sleep because predators moved through that corridor at night, knowing how long a water source could be trusted in a dry spell, knowing how to read weather signs in time to find cover. This knowledge wasn't magical or instinctive. It was learned, tested, and transmitted over long periods of time. It was one of the most important things that groups carried with them, right alongside their tools and their hides. Group support mattered in the most direct possible way when someone was injured, sick, or exhausted. The evidence for care of the vulnerable in ancient human groups is real. Individuals who could not have survived without sustained help from others did in fact survive. That tells us something significant. Risk was managed collectively, not just individually. The knowledge that others would help if you were hurt, that the group wouldn't simply leave you behind at the first sign of incapacity, was itself a form of security that shaped behavior and reduced the stakes of individual vulnerability. The world these people moved through was genuinely dangerous. But they were not helpless inside it. They were, in most cases, skilled, cautious, mutually reliant people who had learned to navigate a hazardous environment with an intelligence shaped by exactly that kind of pressure over an enormous stretch of time. All of that risk, all of that skill required just to persist. And yet the story doesn't end there. Because here is something that gets underemphasized in most popular accounts of Stone Age life, something that cuts against the image of people too consumed by basic survival to think about anything else. The evidence strongly suggests they did think about other things. Quite a lot, actually. There's a tendency to assume that leisure, art, ritual and symbolic behavior were luxuries that emerged only after survival was firmly secured, some kind of cognitive upgrade that arrived once food was plentiful and predators were no longer a daily concern. This assumption feels intuitively reasonable, but the archaeological record doesn't support it cleanly. Instead, what we find is evidence of symbolic and expressive behavior woven into human life at surprisingly early dates, in contexts where survival pressures were very much still present. Meaning-making, it seems, wasn't something people got around to after solving all their other problems. It may have been part of how they solved them. The physical evidence is fragmentary but genuinely compelling. Perforated shells and animal teeth worn as beads appear in the record from well over 100,000 years ago in multiple locations across Africa and eventually Europe. These weren't functional objects. They didn't make food easier to find or wounds easier to heal. They were things worn on the body to communicate something: identity, status, group affiliation, beauty, perhaps mourning or memory. That impulse to mark the self, to signal meaning through ornamentation, is deeply old. Ochre, a reddish iron oxide pigment, was gathered, processed and used in ways that go far beyond any obvious practical application tens of thousands of years before the famous painted caves of Europe. Whether it was used on the body, on objects, or in burial contexts is debated. That it was used intentionally and repeatedly is not. The painted caves themselves, Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, and dozens of others, represent a flowering of visual art so striking that it changed how scholars thought about early cognition when it was first encountered. What drove people to go deep into dark, difficult cave passages and paint animals in fluid, naturalistic lines? Ritual, ceremony, storytelling, the recording of knowledge about prey behavior, individual expression. It's genuinely unknown. Most researchers think the answer probably involves more than one of these things simultaneously, and that the question itself may reflect a false separation between art, knowledge, and spiritual practice that these people wouldn't have recognized. What's clear is that someone found this worth doing. Worth the effort, worth the ochre and charcoal, worth descending into the dark with nothing but a small lamp. That effort implies meaning. Music is harder to trace because most instruments, voice, percussion on stretched hides, rhythm on hollow logs, hand clapping, leave nothing behind. But bone flutes have been found in Europe dating back tens of thousands of years, worked into instruments capable of producing a range of notes. If flutes existed, singing almost certainly existed before them. Rhythm and repetition in sound appear to be deeply rooted in human cognition, connected to group bonding, emotional regulation, and ceremonial practice across cultures separated by vast distances. It would be more surprising if Stone Age people didn't sing or drum than if they did. What all of this points toward is a population for whom the line between practical life and symbolic life was probably not as sharp as we tend to draw it. A story told around a fire about where the deer had been seen last season was at once entertainment, practical intelligence, and social bonding. A burial that included a handful of ochre or a piece of jewelry was at once a final act of care for an individual, a statement about that person's significance, and possibly an expression of belief about what happened after death. A design carved into bone could be a record, a mark of ownership, or an aesthetic choice, possibly all three at once. Meaning-making likely permeated ordinary activity rather than being reserved for special ceremonial occasions. But it's worth being honest about something. Leisure itself, as a distinct category of time, probably looked different from what that word suggests today. The amount of downtime available to any given group depended heavily on conditions that fluctuated constantly. In seasons of food abundance, when the hunting had been good and the gathering productive, there was more time to sit, to talk, to make things that weren't strictly necessary. When food was scarce, or a long journey was underway, or sickness had moved through the group, discretionary time contracted accordingly. This isn't trivial. It means that the experience of leisure was variable, seasonal, and tied to the material circumstances of the moment in ways that most people today don't have to navigate. Even so, the evidence from studies of contemporary and historically documented forager groups consistently challenges the image of endless grinding labor with no room for anything else. The anthropologist Marshall Salins famously and somewhat controversially described hunter-gatherers as the original affluent society, not wealthy by material standards, but frequently wealthy in time, working fewer hours per day than people in agricultural or industrial economies. This characterization has been debated and qualified significantly in the decades since, but the core observation holds: foragers did not necessarily spend every waking moment in productive labor. There were hours, in many cases substantial hours, that were spent in ways that look recognizable as rest, socializing, play, and creative activity. Time at the hearth, which we'll return to shortly when we talk about evenings specifically, was almost certainly one of the main arenas for this. Fire is a gathering point. It provides warmth, light, safety, and a natural center of social gravity. Around it, people talked. They processed the events of the day. They told stories, almost certainly, about things that happened, about things remembered, about the world as they understood it, about figures and events that may have moved into the territory of myth. Children listened. Older people passed on knowledge in forms that were engaging as well as informative. Grudges were aired, alliances were reinforced, plans were made. This kind of social processing is not a distraction from survival. For social animals like us, it is part of survival. It's also possible, maybe even likely, that humor was part of it. Imitation, exaggeration, mockery, gently or not so gently applied. The same cognitive flexibility that produced cave paintings and bone flutes and elaborate tools was available for play, and play in humans is not an exclusively juvenile behavior. It is a way of exploring possibility, testing ideas, and maintaining the social fabric through shared amusement. There's no archaeological evidence for jokes, of course, but there's no reason to think Stone Age people were exempt from the human impulse toward laughter. What the full picture suggests is a life that was hard, genuinely, comprehensively hard, in ways that are difficult to overstate, and also a life in which people reached, reliably and repeatedly, for more than mere continuation. They made beautiful things. They buried their dead with care. They sang, probably. They told stories, almost certainly. They looked at the world around them and found it worth representing, worth commemorating, worth understanding not just practically but symbolically. That impulse is older than farming, older than cities. It may be in some form older than our species as we currently define it. And it was very much alive in the ordinary hours of an ordinary Stone Age day. As the light shifted and the day's work wound down, something changed in the rhythm of the camp. The scattered activity of morning and afternoon, the ranging, the hauling, the focused labour of toolmaking and hideworking began to contract. People moved toward the fire. This is one of the things we can say with reasonable confidence about Stone Age evenings. Fire was the organising principle. Everything else arranged itself around it. The hearth isn't a romantic abstraction here. It was genuinely the centre of gravity for a group at rest, providing the three things that mattered most when the sun went down: warmth, light, and a degree of protection. Darkness in a world without artificial lighting is something most of us have never actually experienced. Not the relative dark of a suburban night with its ambient glow from nearby towns, but true, deep, disorienting darkness in which the landscape beyond the firelight became essentially invisible. That shift happened fast, and it changed everything about how the group related to the world outside its circle of warmth. What was probably cooking over or near that fire depended on what the day had produced. Meat, if the hunting had gone well or a previous kill still had portions worth preserving. Root vegetables, seeds or plant material gathered earlier. Evidence from archaeological sites suggests that cooking was practiced far earlier than people used to assume. Controlled fire use goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and the effects of heat on food, including improved digestibility and reduced pathogen load, may have had significant consequences for human evolution itself. By the time we're talking about anatomically modern humans, cooking wasn't a new experiment. It was a well-established part of how food was made usable. Roasting meat directly over coals was probably the most straightforward method, but there's evidence for other approaches too: stone boiling, in which heated rocks were placed in water or a vessel to bring liquid to temperature, and smoking or drying meat to extend its viability over days or weeks. The smell of an evening fire with meat cooking over it, the sounds of fat dripping and sizzling, the gradual shift from raw to cooked. These were sensory experiences that structured the end of the day in ways that feel recognizable even across the vast distance of time. Shared food, prepared and consumed together, is one of the most consistent features of human social life across cultures and periods. Eating together likely reinforced the social cohesion that had already been building through the day's shared effort, but the evening probably extended beyond the meal itself. This is where the question of nighttime behavior becomes genuinely interesting. Several researchers studying the social patterns of contemporary forager groups have noted something striking. The content of conversations around evening fires tends to differ meaningfully from the content of daytime talk. Daytime talk is more practical, coordinating activity, discussing immediate tasks, working through specific problems. Evening talk, by contrast, tends to shift towards storytelling, memory, shared history, and what might loosely be called the moral or social imagination of the group. There's reason to think something similar was true in the deep past. The fire, as a gathering point, combined with the enforced stillness of darkness, may have created conditions particularly suited to the longer, more narrative kinds of conversation. Stories that explained the landscape, that encoded knowledge about animal behavior in memorable form, that described the group's history or the characteristics of neighboring groups. These would have had real practical value alongside their entertainment value. A story about where the river flooded 2 generations ago, or which signs in the forest indicated a certain predator's presence, or how a particular type of plant had once caused sickness, was knowledge packaged in a format that could be retained and transmitted. The evening fire may have been the primary educational environment for much of human prehistory. Planning almost certainly happened in these hours too. Tomorrow's route, the decision about whether to move the camp, the question of who would go where and in what formation, these conversations probably took place in the warmth and relative safety of the fire's circle, with the full group or its senior members present in a way that wasn't always possible during the scattered business of the day. Then there was the fire itself as an object of ongoing concern. Keeping it alive through the night wasn't trivial. Fire starting in the Stone Age was skilled, effortful work. Friction-based methods required the right materials, the right technique and practice. A fire that went out during the night meant starting again from scratch in the cold and dark, a problem serious enough that maintaining an existing fire was almost always preferable to letting it die. This may have shaped sleep patterns directly. Some researchers have proposed that early human sleep was more segmented than the consolidated 8-hour block that modern people tend to treat as the biological default, that people woke periodically through the night, tended the fire, perhaps exchanged a few words, and slept again. Whether this was universal is unknown, but the idea that darkness meant an uninterrupted and uniform period of unconsciousness seems less likely than a more variable pattern, responsive to the needs of the fire and the sounds of the surrounding environment, because the environment beyond the firelight was not quiet and it was not safe. Predators were a genuine part of the nighttime equation. Big cats, hyenas, wolves and other carnivores were more active after dark, and the fire served a real deterrent function that was understood and maintained accordingly. This means the emotional texture of nighttime was probably different from daytime in ways that went beyond simple tiredness. The darkness that surrounded the warmth of the hearth was not neutral. It was the territory of things that could kill you, and the fire was the boundary between managed space and unmanaged risk. That awareness held lightly on a good night, perhaps more urgently on a night when something moved at the edge of the dark, would have given the evening fire its particular quality of refuge. Warmth, food, familiar voices, firelight against darkness, the sounds of breathing and sleep beginning to settle over the group, and somewhere beyond the glow, the world going about its own nighttime business. The people sitting at that hearth knew the difference between inside and outside in a way that was immediate and visceral, not abstract. The fire they tended was the margin between those two states, and they tended it carefully. This is where the day gathered itself, found its shape, and began to hand off to night. What happened next? How sleep itself worked, how the body and the group prepared to begin again, is a quieter story, and one worth examining on its own terms. The fire's edge marked the beginning of something different, not just the cessation of activity, but a distinct phase of the day with its own demands and its own logic. Sleep, for Stone Age humans, was almost certainly not the simple withdrawal from the world that we might imagine. It was itself a form of engagement, structured by the environment, shaped by the group, and deeply embedded in the ongoing project of staying alive. Consider the conditions. Sleeping outdoors or in a rudimentary shelter that offered limited insulation from the surrounding air meant that temperature was not something you adjusted with a thermostat. It shifted through the night as the landscape radiated its stored heat back into a cooling sky, and then dropped further in the hours before dawn. Seasonal variation made this more or less extreme, but even in temperate conditions, the difference between midnight and pre-dawn could be significant enough to interrupt sleep, trigger shivering, or prompt people to draw closer to each other or to the fire's remaining warmth. Bodies positioned themselves in response to that gradient, turning, curling, seeking shared heat, in ways that were probably habitual rather than conscious. Then there was sound. The auditory landscape of a world without machinery, without traffic, without the constant low hum of electrical infrastructure, is sometimes romanticized as peaceful. It wasn't necessarily the acoustic environment of the Pleistocene was rich, variable, and informative in ways that the sleeping brain was almost certainly calibrated to monitor. A shift in wind direction, the sudden silence of insects, a movement in the undergrowth at a particular distance, these were signals that carried potential meaning. The human nervous system under those conditions would not have treated sleep as an opportunity to tune everything out completely. A certain level of ambient awareness, the kind that could tip back into full wakefulness quickly, was probably not just useful, but selected for. People who slept too deeply in genuinely dangerous environments left fewer descendants than people whose sleep remained responsive to the world around them. This connects to one of the more interesting questions about Stone Age sleep, whether it was organized in the consolidated single-block pattern that modern people tend to assume is natural, or whether it was segmented, interrupted, and flexible in ways that better matched the actual conditions of nighttime life. There's historical evidence, and some anthropological evidence from contemporary forager groups, suggesting that segmented sleep, in which people wake naturally in the middle of the night for a period of quiet wakefulness before sleeping again, may be more consistent with human biology than the 8-hour block that industrialized societies have largely standardized. If fire-tending required periodic attention, if security concerns meant that some level of monitoring was always happening, and if sleeping bodies responded to temperature shifts by naturally lightening their sleep in the colder pre-dawn hours, then the night was probably not a uniform stretch of unconsciousness but something more varied and permeable. Group sleeping arrangements almost certainly played a role in making night manageable. Sleeping together, in close physical proximity, bodies sharing warmth and the low-level social signals of breath and movement was probably the default, and it carried real advantages. Shared vigilance, even among people who were technically asleep, meant that the group's collective sensitivity to disturbance was greater than any individual's. A sound that one person's sleeping brain registered and partially processed might generate enough subtle response to alert others nearby. This is less mystical than it sounds. It's simply the aggregate of many nervous systems, each monitoring at low levels, functioning as a distributed early warning network. It's also worth noting that sleeping in physical contact with other people is associated with physiological benefits, reduced cortisol levels, regulated body temperature, a sense of security that may have allowed for somewhat deeper sleep than solitary sleeping would have permitted. The social function of nighttime didn't simply pause when people closed their eyes. Seasonal rhythms almost certainly shaped sleep patterns in ways that are difficult for people in climate-controlled environments to fully appreciate. In winter, longer nights meant more time in darkness, and it seems likely that sleep expanded to fill more of that time, not necessarily in one stretch, but distributed differently than summer's shorter nights would allow. In summer, earlier dawns and later dusks compressed the dark hours and may have led to shorter or lighter sleep, possibly supplemented by midday rest during the hottest parts of the afternoon. The idea that early humans maintained the same rigid sleep schedule year-round seems unlikely given how directly their experience of light and temperature varied with the seasons. Sleep was probably more seasonal, more flexible, and more opportunistic than our modern frameworks tend to suggest. Rest, it's worth emphasizing, was not simply an empty interval between productive activity. The body's overnight work, tissue repair, immune function, memory consolidation, hormonal regulation, was directly relevant to the demands of the following day. A person who had spent the previous day walking 10 or 15 miles, processing an animal carcass, carrying heavy loads, and remaining alert to environmental threat needed recovery in a way that was quite literal. The muscles that would be needed for tomorrow's hunt, the immune responses that stood between a small wound and a dangerous infection, the cognitive clarity required for tracking or navigation, all of these depended on what happened during sleep. Rest wasn't a luxury appended to a productive day. It was the preparation for the next one, as essential to survival as the food that had been gathered and consumed. There's something worth sitting with in that framing. The cycle of a Stone Age day didn't really end at the fire's edge. It transformed. The effort that had begun with waking, reading the morning air, deciding which direction to move, managing the complex social dynamics of a group whose members depended on each other for survival, continued in a different register through the night, in the body's quiet labor of restoration and the group's distributed monitoring of the dark. Tomorrow's capacity was being built in tonight's sleep, which meant that sleep was part of the same continuous enterprise as everything that had come before it. And then dawn came again, the temperature at its lowest point, the birds starting their reassertion of the soundscape. The fire, if it had been tended, still holding some of its warmth. Bodies beginning to stir, reluctant at first, then responding to the light. The same basic needs as the day before, and the same fundamental uncertainty about whether they would be met. The same landscape to be read, the same knowledge to be applied, the same relationships to be navigated. Not exactly the same day repeated. Seasons shifted, camps moved, circumstances changed, but the same deep structure, the same cycle of expenditure and recovery, effort and rest, risk and return. It's worth remembering, as the day begins again in imagination, that the people who lived this cycle were not diminished versions of ourselves. They were fully human, carrying the same cognitive complexity, the same emotional range, the same capacity for attachment and curiosity and meaning-making that we carry. The day they faced was harder in many concrete ways, and more uncertain and more physically demanding. But they faced it with everything that we have, and arguably with skills and attentiveness that most of us have never had occasion to develop. There's a temptation, when trying to reconstruct a Stone Age day, to arrive at a single portrait, to say this is what it was like. But the honest conclusion is more complicated and more interesting. What we've traced through this reconstruction is not a universal template. It's a composite, drawn from archaeology, from ethnography, from paleoecology, from the study of how bodies move and work and recover, and it applies unevenly across thousands of generations, dozens of environments, and an almost incomprehensible range of human circumstances. The hunter, sleeping near a fire on the Eurasian steppe 40,000 years ago, was living a meaningfully different life than the forager, navigating a coastal estuary in southern Africa at the same time, or the plant specialist working the edges of a river valley in the Levant. There was no single Stone Age day. There were countless variations on a set of shared pressures. What they shared is worth dwelling on. Across all that variation, the daily life of Stone Age humans combined labor and intelligence in ways that modern assumptions tend to separate. We have a tendency, and it's worth examining honestly, to associate technological simplicity with cognitive simplicity. If the tools were made of stone, the thinking must have been basic. If there was no writing, no metallurgy, no architecture, then the minds behind those lives must have been operating at some lower register. This is not just inaccurate, it inverts the actual relationship. The intelligence embedded in ordinary acts was extraordinary precisely because it had to be. Knowing which plants were edible and which were toxic, and how processing changed that calculus. Reading terrain to predict where animals would move and when. Carrying a mental map of a landscape across hundreds of square miles of features with no written reference. Managing the social dynamics of a group whose internal tensions could, in genuinely bad circumstances, be as dangerous as anything the environment produced. None of this required literacy or metallurgy. It required the same cognitive architecture that we use today, applied to a vastly broader and more demanding problem set. The hidden skills are particularly worth naming. Gathering looks from the outside, like walking and picking. It was nothing of the kind. It was a system of knowledge about phenology, about soil, about the relationship between rainfall and root depth, about which indicators in one plant's behavior predicted something about another's, built over years of observation and transmitted through careful teaching. Toolmaking looks like hitting rocks together. It was an acquired manual skill with a meaningful learning curve, sensitive to the specific properties of specific raw materials, capable of producing objects whose functional geometry required real precision. Even carrying the act of moving a butchered animal or a bundle of gathered plants across difficult terrain involved judgments about load distribution, route selection, and physical management that prevented injury and conserved energy over long distances. These were not simple acts performed by simple people. They were skilled acts performed by people who had been learning since childhood and who continued refining that skill throughout their lives. Teaching ran through all of it. The transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next wasn't incidental to daily life. It was woven into it, happening at the fireside, on the trail, at the butchering site, through observation and imitation and correction. Children were participants, not spectators. The cognitive investment required to maintain, transmit, and adapt a body of practical knowledge across generations was itself a form of labor, and it was ongoing. Cooperation made almost everything else possible. The threshold between what one person could accomplish and what a coordinated group could accomplish was enormous in hunting, in defense, in childcare, in the management of illness and injury, in the simple fact that shared knowledge exceeded individual knowledge by a significant margin. The social fabric of a Stone Age group was not a backdrop to survival. It was one of the primary mechanisms of it. And then there was risk. It was present in ways that most people in industrialized societies genuinely never encounter, not as an abstraction or a statistical probability, but as a daily companion. Infection from a small wound, a predator at the edge of vision, a storm with no solid shelter, a season that turned early. The people who navigated these risks successfully were not lucky. They were competent, attentive, adaptable, and skilled. The ones who were not those things tended not to survive long enough to leave descendants. Archaeology struggles, perhaps more than anything else, to recover the ordinary day. Monuments endure. Spectacular burials endure. Art on cave walls endures. But the texture of daily life, the decisions made on the move, the knowledge exchanged around a fire, the particular way someone carried a load or taught a child to nap, evaporates almost entirely. What we recover are traces, and the work of interpretation is always provisional, always incomplete. That incompleteness isn't a failure of archaeology. It's a reflection of how much was actually there. The ordinary day of a Stone Age human was dense with skill, knowledge, relationship, and meaning. It was hard in ways that are difficult to fully imagine, and it was not, by any honest measure, simple.